evening, and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, DNA Secrets with Libby Copeland. My name is Deborah Hoffman, and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Libby and I will be in conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes, during which time she'll answer my questions, and then she'll field questions from you, the audience. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube, and feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Libby Copeland is an award-winning freelance journalist who's written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Thank you for joining us tonight, Libby.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I have to say, I loved your book. I read it in 4 days. And for me, the stories of the people were so compelling. And I really loved Alice, who was your star character. So let's talk about Alice.
Yeah.
The story of Alice Collins' playbook frames your book. And without spoiling the story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Sure. Thank you. It's a great question to start us off, and I'm so thrilled to be here. So thank you for having me. The book that I wrote, The Lost Family, looks at the home DNA testing industry from a number of points of view. It's looking at it as a business. It's looking at it as a kind of a cultural phenomenon. It's looking at the bioethics and privacy issues that come with it. And it's looking at the science. But more than anything, it is looking at it from the intimate point of view of the lives of ordinary Americans. Ordinary Americans whose points of view, whose identities, whose families have been fundamentally reshaped by the revelations that are contained in these files, right? We live in this moment where genealogy is a really big deal. It's very popular, and where DNA testing is extremely popular and cheaper and easier than ever to do. And what that means is that we suddenly have our hands on, access to fundamental facts about our families, about our sort of, the ways we came to this country, the ways our families were formed, and sometimes about our own genetic identities, our own origins, that are surprising and that are profound in terms of how they impact how we see the world. And Alice is kind of the perfect protagonist to take us through my book, The Lost Family, because of a number of reasons. First of all, she's just a great kind of person to, hold her hand and learn from. She's a genetic genealogist. She's remarkably intelligent and funny and wise. And she gets her hands on a really big problem that she needs to solve. And the problem is the mystery of her own DNA. And she's a very methodical person with this kind of a scientific bent. So she attacks the problem in this, this really methodical way, and essentially launches herself on this existential detective story, right? That takes her 2.5 years to solve. What's interesting about Alice is she tests back in 2012. That's just 8 years ago, but it's a very long time in the context of this industry. There were fewer than 1 million people who had taken a home DNA test at that time. Today, there are more than 37 million DNA test kits that have been sold. So that is a vast difference in terms of the impact on the lives of people across the world, but primarily Americans, because it's really Americans who are testing. And she tests at a time when she's not even sure how reliable the results are going to be. She's a genealogist. She's looking to break through some brick walls. And she tests without knowing, what a lot of people are much more aware of today, which is that sometimes you can get something that really conflicts with your expectations. She thinks that she is Irish American. All of her research and experience tells her that she is Irish American. All of her genealogy tells her she's Irish American. The results tell her she's something else. They tell her that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Eastern and Central Europe who have a unique genetic signature that looks different from somebody whose grandparents come from Ireland, as she believes. And this is so kind of unexpected that she first writes to the company, which is Ancestry, which is a company most of us are familiar with. It's the biggest database now in terms of DNA samples. And she tells them, you guys aren't ready for prime time. You don't know what you're doing yet. Which is a reasonable surmise, because at the time, the Ancestry test, the DNA test that Ancestry was putting out was new. In fact, it was still in beta testing. And it was really hard to for her to predict how reliable it would be. But she continued to investigate. She thought, maybe there's something here. She took another test at another company called 23andMe, which we've all again heard of. It's the second largest database. And the second test confirmed the results of the first, and she started digging. What's interesting about Alice is that her story, it takes a lot of twists and turns. There's some, red herrings. There's some unexpected twists. There's some very surprising ending. But she goes through all the kind of expected explanations for her unexpected ethnicity. Like, she goes through the possibility that, she's not related to her dad genetically, which is a common phenomenon within the world of DNA surprises. She investigates the possibility that she's adopted. She's able to dismiss those. She's able to dismiss the possibility that she's donor conceived. And her final theory is the possibility that she comes from a community of people who hid their genetic ancestry. So maybe, somewhere along the line, somebody converted from Judaism and didn't tell their children right. And maybe that's what's going on. It's not what's going on for her. And the results ultimately are so surprising, and they go back 100 years. And so I got to do some historical research going back a century, which was really fun. But what I liked about using her story is kind of this spine. I call her story the spine of the fish of the book. Because whenever you come to a kind of inflection point where she's considering a new theory, I get to veer off and explore what it does look like to discover, for instance, that you're not genetically related to your dad. That is a phenomenon known as a non-paternity event, or not parent expected in this world. It's often shortened to NPE. Sometimes it's called an MPE for misattributed parentage experience. And that experience, simply because there's a statistical possibility that this will happen to you. It's not a large one, but it's a significant one, spread across the number of people who've tested, has yielded many Americans who are going through this experience of often in midlife, sometimes later, suddenly discovering that their own origins aren't what they thought, that that their fathers aren't genetically related to them, that they owe half their lives essentially to a stranger they've never met. And that is a kind of a profound moment of genetic reckoning that an increasing number of Americans find themselves in. So Alice is she's the person who kind of takes us on this journey and shows us all these kind of points of view of different people and what they're experiencing right now as a result of this fascinating technology.
Yeah, and she's just an amazing person to get to know through your book. So you mentioned NPEs, non-paternity events. How do you find that people respond to those? Both the seeker who pursued the information by getting their DNA tested and the family members who did not.
Yeah, so these really look different depending on where you stand in relation to the secret that was kept, because this is usually family, category of family secrets, and the nature of the revelation, right? It looks a lot different to discover that you are the product of an NPE, which is to say that your father is someone other than the man you thought him to be, than it is to, for instance, discover that you are the father in question, who conceived a child. Maybe you knew it, back in 1970. Maybe you didn't know it and you're discovering it now, and you have 3 children and a spouse, and this is coming at you in your 70s, right? And it looks different depending on whether you're, say, the wife of the man who's making the discovery or the sibling. So it's really kind of like a Rashomon kind of experience where, people have a very profoundly different story to tell depending on where they stand in relationship to the same event. And so the person who makes the discovery that let's say they're 50 years old, they're discovering they're not genetically related to the man they consider dad, almost always, to me, have described this, and from the research I've seen, describe this as a trauma. It's a big deal. And sometimes they'll seek out therapeutic advice. And if the therapist isn't familiar with this phenomenon, they'll say, what's the big deal? It is a very big deal. It invites a rethinking of the entirety of your life. It invites you to kind of rethink the trajectory of your life, because when you're beginning, your once upon a time changes, it changes everything else. It changes the tenor of your relationships with your parents, and it can constitute what feels like a breach of trust. If, for instance, your mother knew and didn't tell you, that can feel like a big breach of trust that leads to like a rupture in the relationship. It can lead to people rethinking memories that they had, something that happened when they were a child, something that they hung on to that didn't make sense and now suddenly acquires context. And then very often for those people who are making that discovery, there's a desire to either reach out or at the very least research more about their genetic kin on their paternal side. So they might want to know who their dad is, or their genetic father, I should say, because they may already have a dad. They may want to know who their genetic father is. They may want to know who their siblings are. They may want to see pictures. They may want to know about their roots. And then they are reaching out, right? And there's a variety of reactions from people on the other side. And I've written a number of those stories, NPE, reunion stories in The Lost Family. There are men who are so kind of overwhelmed by guilt about the child that they had and didn't know about and weren't able to take responsibility for, that they kind of can't square it with their understanding of themselves, right? It's just too painful, and they cut off contact. I have a story in the book about a man who deletes his kit. I have another story in the book about a man who is so kind of feels so encroached upon by his biological daughter's phone calls and desire for connection. He tells her first, these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. And eventually he and his wife wind up contacting their attorney, and their attorney sends her a letter saying, please stop contacting my clients. And that is heartbreaking for her. And then on the other side, there are some fathers who they feel that it's a blessing, right? It's like a late in life blessing. And for the siblings, the newly found half siblings, they can feel threatened, they can feel welcoming, often different reactions within one family. Sometimes you're able to have, like, a person who's experiencing a non-paternity event is able to have a relationship with, two siblings and not the third. Or, only one sibling behind the back of the father because the father doesn't sanction it. So these are really complicated stories, very nuanced, and they're not easily resolved, and they're not kind of over quickly. There's no bow that they get tied up in. They're almost always kind of emotionally volatile, complex situations.
Yeah, and you had several different storylines related to that. So you've touched on this a little bit, but it's fascinating to consider the implications for those who have not been tested, and yet here they are. Would you just say more about that?
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, there have been 37 million DNA test kits sold through the 4 major companies. And I'll just back up and give you like a little context for this industry. There's 4 major companies: Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. And they're broadly known as under the umbrella of the recreational DNA testing industry. And they started 21 years ago, and they have always emphasized the search for roots, the search for family history. There's often within, for instance, 23andMe, there's health-related testing. find out about your risk of early onset Alzheimer's, find out about your possibility of carrying a particular mutation, that sort of thing. But the thrust of them, and the advertising, and the main attraction for most Americans has been this idea of discovering your roots. And when you take a test, which involves either spitting into a vial or swabbing your cheek, you're getting two key pieces of information. You're getting your DNA relatives. So those are people who have tested with the same company, who show up in the database as related to you because you and they share overlapping genetic segments. And that science of predicting relatives, revealing relatives, is very, very reliable and robust. You can count on that. The other is ethnicity estimates, and that the fact that they are estimates and that they change is contained right there in the phrase ethnicity estimates. And that's a pie chart that shows you where in the world your various branches of your family tree came from, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And so those are the two key pieces of information that you're getting generally, depending on where you're testing. And I'm coming back to your question. Repeat it one more time, because I think I went off slightly far ways.
I'm just wondering about the implications for people who have not been tested.
Thank you. So with the number of people that are in the databases, it is increasingly not so much an option to opt out. By that I mean, even if you have not taken a test, you are potentially impacted by this technology. You may find out something about your family or your health as a result of the fact that other people have tested. And you are potentially identifiable, even if you're not in the database, to somebody who is related to you and who is looking for you. Okay, so that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. Again, it really varies depending on your perspective. But let's say you were a sperm donor in 1969. And let's say that you were promised anonymity at that time, because a lot of fertility labs did that. And of course, they couldn't anticipate the DNA age. The fact that you have chosen not to test actually does not protect you from being identified. And that's because if you have an adult child out there, the product of that sperm who's looking for you, that child can probably at this point fairly easily identify you based on the fact that you have a whole bunch of cousins in the databases already. From a second cousin or closer match, it's not that difficult. It involves doing some genealogical research and doing some kind of present day research on the internet involving social media and other resources that are available online. But it's really not that difficult. A couple of years ago, Ancestry, which again is the largest database, was telling people that on average, their typical consumer when they tested was getting 50,000 DNA cousins. So on average, if you can imagine, every person who's listening to this is going to be able to discover that tens of thousands of cousins. So, even if you don't test, you're not invisible, simply because of the nature of overlapping genetic segments. Your genetic information is already in those databases. And that essentially leads us to a kind of a tipping point, which is that, this technology in some ways is optional, of course. There are privacy concerns that yield people not wanting to test, and their decision not to test may help protect them if some worst case scenario privacy breach comes to pass. They may be protected by their decision not to test. But in another sense, when you're thinking about the privacy of the past and of the family and the revelatory power of DNA, the decision to test or not to test is in some ways moot, because family secrets, those secrets of a genetic nature, they're coming out, right? And they're kind of inevitable at this point. And even if you don't test, someone else is going to test, or your adult child's going to test, or a sibling's going to test, right? And you're going to find out something about your family that maybe you weren't expecting. And that means we're sort of in a moment where we need to be talking about the past and the way that it shapes us, even when we didn't know the ways in which it was shaping us. It means we're sort of in a moment of cultural national conversation.
Exactly. In your book, it's clear that home DNA testing impacts some communities more than others, adoptees, for example, and people who are donor conceived. Can you just talk more about that sort of impact?
Yeah, absolutely. a lot of people may know or may not know that a lot of states seal the birth certificates that pertain to people who were adopted. So people who are adopted are not able to access their own birth certificates, which would contain the names of their birth parents. So there's this essential element of their own identities that is closed off from them and that they have no ability to change. And they have no way of knowing if, for instance, they have siblings or birth parents still alive who might want to know them, right? There's no kind of cross communication. So that's access to biological relatives and access to fundamental questions about your own identity that are simply unanswered if you don't have that information. With donor conceived people, a lot of sperm donors are anonymous. It can be very difficult to find out the identity of your donor. We call them donors, although in reality, they're paid. So we need a probably better term for the men who sell their sperm, right, to fertility labs. And you may have many siblings out there. I mean, there's it's kind of an interesting thing. The DNA age has forced some revelations about the fertility industry, including the fact that there are no restrictions on the number of children that one donor can conceive. So there are, in some cases, these sprawling networks of between 100 and 200 half siblings who are finding each other now in the DNA age, right? And that's something that was true before, but the DNA age sort of forces our understanding and recognition of that because now all these siblings are finding each other. So just to cycle back to adopted people, starting about 10 years ago, they were the ones, they and people working with them, search angels working with them, were the ones who pioneered techniques that allowed them to find relatives through the databases who were not in the databases. So this techniques I was talking about earlier, triangulating information from cousins and then doing genealogical research and then coming back down and doing reverse genealogy to the present day, that allowed people to, for example, identify a birth father or a birth mother. And that came entirely from citizen scientists, entirely from activists, entirely from consumers. It didn't come from the companies. The companies weren't the ones who figured out that you could do this. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And now we are, 10 years on from the development of those techniques, and it is easier than ever because the size of the databases has grown. So instead of trying to figure out your identity from, multiple fourth cousins, which could take a really long time and you have to go way back into the past and it may not even be possible. It might take months, it might take years, it might not happen. Now people are testing and very quickly finding a first or second cousin or even closer. And that makes the job of understanding who they came from and where they came from much easier.
Right. What did your research reveal about the implications of home DNA testing for the African American community, given the history of slavery in America?
Yeah, that's another group that's been really impacted. I mean, we are in a moment of revelation, right? The past, which has kind of, been there this whole time, curled into our cells. We have we are in this incredible moment of being able to access it and kind of, crack it open and ask it its secrets. Genealogists who specialize in things like, Holocaust records, for instance, are being able to, reunite families who were separated during the Holocaust, groups driven apart by war and migration, groups that have been sort of historically, underprivileged by the records, the genealogical records, or subjected to the histories of cruelty, right? DNA can be an incredible force for them. So in particular, African Americans, this is true. If you look at sort of, who is worthy of being written about and recorded, that question of who's in the record, who's in the genealogical record, that usually goes hand in hand with people in positions of power, higher status in a society, right? So to have a record of your great great grandparent, for instance, maybe that person needed to have been literate to keep a diary. Maybe they would have been needed to be considered worthy of being recorded. Maybe they needed to have land that they sold in order to be in certain land records and things like that. In particular, African Americans, if you are researching before your ancestors through the federal census, you're going to hit a big brick wall if you try to go back before 1870, because once those ancestors were enslaved, they were no longer named in the federal census. They were tick marks in a box. So you're following your ancestors, and then they disappear, right? What do you do? A lot of African Americans have turned to DNA. And I write in my book, about some of the power of this for African American genealogists. One genealogist who manages to research enough about the family to confirm oral history that was passed down, having to do with a child that was the product of a white enslaver and a black enslaved woman. So that's sort of gratifying, and also gives shape to the bones of that life. It allows that genealogist to illuminate the life of the ancestor. Another genealogist that I write about manages to connect with a DNA cousin, so a genetic cousin, who lives in Africa now, and whose people never left. So they are related to one another distantly since, going back to before the transatlantic slave trade. And that person is able to tell this African American genealogist about this branch of the family and to say, here's who our people were. They were from this particular community. Now, that knowledge of knowing the name of that community is really powerful. It means more than just knowing that they came from a present day country that may not have existed on a map back in the day, right? Or, West Africa or some vague region, because with the gift of that name of that people, this genealogist then can look them up, and he does. And he finds research papers about them, going back to what their lives would have been like back then, the foods they ate, the customs, the ways that their migration patterns, the daily rituals of their lives. So he is able to make this incredible connection to what his ancestors were doing before they were brought over in chains. And that is just a remarkable gift for him.
Yeah. Life-changing, I would
Yes.
imagine. Yes.
Yeah.
What happens when family histories and family narratives collide?
So, the work of writing The Lost Family was in many ways investigating that question. What is the 360 of a family secret uncovered? And what happens when the existence of one person threatens the sacred narratives of somebody else? Sometimes it's really painful for the seeker. The seeker is the term I use for people who, are trying to understand themselves through an understanding of their own roots or their own past, right? So these are people who take a test. Maybe they knew they were looking for the answer to a question, or they didn't even know they had a question until they took the test. But suddenly they become quite interested and obsessed, and they want to know more, right? And they're reaching out to relatives, and they're trying to answer questions that suddenly feel quite pressing, quite important on an existential and psychological level. So to be the seeker in a family or reaching out to a family that doesn't know you exist is really often painful, because you've been made a secret. And there's this saying, don't shoot the messenger, right? And that means don't blame the person who's bringing you the news. That's difficult. What often happens when seekers are made the messengers of their own existence is they are essentially blamed for existing, right? Of course, it's not their fault that this particular man and this particular family had a relationship outside the marriage and had a child that didn't tell anyone. But within that family, that nuclear family that the seeker is approaching, there may be a narrative about those parents, right? A narrative about the loyalty of their long-lived marriage. Right. Or they always knew that he was a certain type of way, but it's so painful to face it that they would rather not, right? Or whatever. So there's often this collision between, my truth and your truth, right? My truth is I exist. Your truth is how dare you come into my life. You're an interloper. You're a stranger who bears genetic similarity to me, and I feel threatened by you. That is really quite heartbreaking. And I've seen cases where people will say, well, I just don't believe the results. I don't believe that you're my half sister. Why not? Well, our mother wouldn't do that. She wouldn't place her child in a basket on a pastor's doorstep at 4 days old and walk away and call from a phone booth and say there's a baby on the doorstep. She would not do that. So you can't be my sister. And meanwhile, these two half sisters are showing up as half sisters in the database. So it's there's not that many other ways that you can kind of get there, right? That is one kind of collision that takes place. The other collision has to do with the cultural clash between past and present. We live in an kind of era when genealogy is big, when the search for your roots is big, all the television shows about finding your roots, the idea that you can discover your own authenticity and kind of define yourself through like understanding like where you came from, right? And we also live in an age of memoir, in an age of therapy, where we have this idea that you tell your story and you normalize it, you validate it for other people, you share your story, and other people's stories also validate yours. I mean, it's a completely different mindset from 60, 70 years ago when certain things were private, certain things were stigmatized, certain things were taboo. You didn't talk about certain things. You didn't talk about the ways different families were made. You didn't talk about the ways children came into the world. If you were a single mom, it might have been a matter of survival to not reveal the circumstances of how your child came to be. So you are really kind of, there's this kind of two things on a kind of a collision course. And, sometimes for some families, there's never the right moment to go to a child who might be at this point 50, 60 years old and say, let me tell you the truth about how you came into the world. Maybe there should be a right moment, but somehow there is never a right moment. And I think there's something about the nature of some of these secrets, which are often based in things like guilt and shame, anger, fear. Sometimes children are conceived through acts of coercion or violence, right? Sometimes they're very painful things to relive. And that secret of how a child came into the world remains preserved in amber through all the decades, even as the culture around them changes. So here it shows up preserved, kind of an artifact from 1955. And the child, this adult child, in her 60s, is taking this test and saying, why didn't you tell me? And going to her mom with maybe some anger and sense of violated trust, right? Well, it made sense back then, right? And there's a great kind of painful conversation that's frankly happening in many families across the country, like right now, right? Which may wind up ultimately being a good thing that we've had this moment where we are having to be honest with each other, even in circumstances where it's quite painful. But man, is it painful? And not every family survives this. It's just sort of a challenging moment that we find ourselves in.
One thing that shows up in your book is the use of DNA databases to solve cold case murders, the Golden State Killer, for example. And can you just talk about how that came about? And also, is it fair for DNA test results that were obtained to illuminate family history to be used to solve crime?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question that's being actively debated right now, and that hasn't really been robustly tested in court. And so there's unanswered questions about sort of where this is going to go and, how widely it will be used. The Golden State Killer was identified and then subsequently arrested and later sentenced back in, gosh, exactly 3 years ago. So I think it was April of 2018. And he was a murderer and rapist who was at large in California in the 70s and 80s. He was actually a former cop. And he was never considered a person of interest to the police. Like, in other words, of the thousands and thousands of leads and tips and, phone calls they got, look into this guy, look into that guy, he was never on their radar. They tried searching for him using law enforcement databases, which use a different way of looking at the DNA, a way that is less informative, less rich, and poses fewer privacy concerns. And they were, and anyway, the limits of that, they were never able to find him, and they can't do basically the techniques that they can do with genealogical databases, which is sort of identify somebody from a relative. So very often using law enforcement databases, if you don't have a direct match or a very close kin, like a sibling or a parent-child, you're not going to find that person, right? So if they haven't been arrested, you're not going to find them. So what do you do with a guy who's not on the radar of the police? That's sort of the problem. The kind of promise of DNA databases to solve crimes was long known within the community of the folks who are known as genetic genealogists. And it was known because for a decade now, they've been using it to help people who are adopted find their birth parents using exactly these techniques. But nobody ever made the leap to using it in this context until the Golden State Killer case. And then in the wake of that, what happened was a whole lot of cases started being solved this way. Mostly the most heinous crimes and mostly cold cases. So cases that they'd thrown every other technique at it and they couldn't solve it. And they even tried maybe, the DNA and the law enforcement databases, and that didn't work. So they used this approach. The complications have to do with a number of things. I mean, there's all these questions about consent, right? Because we share DNA with other people. So, for the same reason why, my decision to test impacts my brother, right, and his privacy, and maybe the privacy of third cousins I've never met. For that same reason, the same sort of themes are at work in the context of arresting a killer potentially, right? Only maybe more so because now you're talking about law enforcement with the power to arrest. So that's part of what makes it so complicated. There's a kind of a debate right now between privacy advocates and public safety advocates. Civil libertarians who say, is this really the right thing to be doing? And, people who say, oh my gosh, we have the opportunity to get these people off the street after all this time. That seems like a good thing. And if I'm the fourth or third cousin of a guy who turns out to be a homicidal maniac, like, I'm down with my DNA being used that way, right? So that's the kind of clash. It's additionally complicated by the fact that that there's this different landscape of databases being used in different ways. So the two largest databases, 23andMe and Ancestry, they kind of have the largest. They're kind of locked up in the sense that it's very hard for law enforcement to access the genetic information in their databases. And as far as we know, they have never been used in this way. Law enforcement would require like a subpoena or a warrant to get in there. And the companies have sort of said, at least 23andMe has said, like, we would fight that. So they would encounter a great deal of resistance. And then there are other companies where, like MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, which is a third-party website, where you can kind of take your DNA from a company like Ancestry and you can upload it to one of them. And that is a kind of a backdoor. And so we know Family Tree DNA, for instance, which is the oldest company in this space, having sent out its first test kits exactly 21 years ago in April of 2000, we know that they were cooperating actually with the FBI without telling their customers, in an apparent violation of their own agreements that they had with their customers for many months before their customers found out. So that is, again, like another layer of kind of complication, which is like when you test, you are you're assuming that the privacy and consent documents that you read, that you're down with them if you bother to read them. They're very long. You might not. I would understand that, right? Number one. Number two, that the company is going to hold up their end of the bargain. But in fact, the companies can unilaterally change their policies at any time. And so there's a certain amount of power that you are giving up with your most private information. And that is, that's an issue with the industry at large. And it's an issue that is especially sort of rendered very dramatic within the context of this new field, which is known as investigative genetic genealogy.
Okay. We do have a couple of audience questions, so I'm going to switch over to them. One person says, what about women? This listener knows a woman who couldn't have kids, and her sister donated an egg and she hired a surrogate. So the child is her niece genetically. This is probably much more unusual, but this person's curious if you have addressed this as well.
Yeah, so the issue of donor sperm is so much more common that I wound up looking at the issue primarily from that point of view. But that's also a phenomenon. I just got an email the other day about someone in this situation who had just been informed that they were conceived by egg donation, and they were kind of grappling with that. So, I mean, that's a subset of a much larger phenomenon. I think that these days parents are much more likely to tell their children, in childhood, that this is how they came into the world, and that is probably for the best to know that early on. So that may not be as great of an issue for children conceived that way because the mores of our time now are that you do tell your child. But back in the day, maybe before egg donation was prevalent, when it was sperm donation entirely, there was a practice of not telling children. In fact, some doctors advised you not to tell your child. In fact, some doctors mixed the sperm of the intended father with the donor. They called it helping the sperm of the intended father. And what it did was it gave both parents kind of plausible deniability to never have to know for sure that the child wasn't genetically the father's. And that was considered the best from the point of view of psychology, family bonds, potential legal issues. It was just considered the best all around. So, we've changed a lot just in the last 60 years in terms of how we view, in terms of how we view, the importance of a child's genetics to their own identity.
Have you talked about, or did you research at all about critical health information that can be learned through DNA, like a propensity for a certain kind of cancer?
Yeah, I looked at that a good deal in the book. It's tricky because the tests that are offered by the direct-to-consumer companies are not as comprehensive as the tests that you get in the context of a doctor's office. So on the one hand, there's a concern, and if you talk to like genetic counselors, for instance, or doctors, they will often talk about their concern that people are not getting the complete picture, or that they don't really have the proper tools to interpret the results. We don't tend to think in terms of the way that the information is presented, so it's kind of hard to know if your slightly elevated risk compared to the average for a particular disease is really a meaningful increase, or it just means you have slightly elevated risk over a risk that's infinitesimally small, so it's not really something you need to worry about, right? So a lot of health-related information that has to do with genetics is, when it's presented in the context of a doctor's office or meeting with a genetic counselor, they can kind of scaffold that for you, and that can be difficult to understand on your own. That's one concern that some medical professionals have. They have this concern about what they call the walking sick and the worrying well. The walking sick are the people who, well, they take a test. Say they take a test through 23andMe. 23andMe just screens for I think it's like a handful of mutations. BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations that would put you at elevated risk of breast cancer. But they're not screening for many other mutations, that would also put you at higher risk. And so you walk away thinking, well, maybe I don't need to get that mammogram because I'm not at risk according to 23andMe. Well, in fact, that's not sort of the most comprehensive panel. And the other concern is this, the worrying well. And there's a great story about this in the New York Times. It was an op-ed about a guy who thought that, he took his results and he downloaded them and uploaded them to a third-party website. And that third-party website told him that he was, I think, at risk of early onset. He was either Alzheimer's or some neurological disease that was really going to be debilitating. And lo and behold, it turned out to be an error. So there's problems with this kind of idea of do-it-yourself diagnosis as communicated through the DTC testing. On the other hand, many of us don't go to the doctor and get a genetic test, right? We just don't. It's expensive. Insurance won't pay for it. There's no particular reason for it. And then there are cases where women, for instance, who had Ashkenazi Jewish heritage and didn't know it, and actually had, one of the BRCA mutations, BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations that put them at higher risk of breast cancer, they had it and they didn't know it. And they took a 23andMe test, for instance, and then caught cancer, in its early stages, or were able to take steps to prevent cancer. So you do hear those stories. And that's kind of the yin yang of this, this technology being available to everyone.
This person says, I've always thought that the price of testing was too high. Will the price come down at some point? Because everything is so computerized now?
That's a good question. I wonder how much this person who's writing in has seen it for. So if you're doing a basic ancestry test, so you're not interested in your health related results, you're just interested in your ethnicity estimate, your DNA relatives, that is advertised as $99, but it's not really $99. It's actually $69 or $59 because they're constantly running sales. So the cheapest I've ever seen it for is $49. I don't know if it would be cheaper. That's a very good question. You're right that the technology gets cheaper, and, it was, they haven't always been able to offer it at this price. I guess I could see that possibility, but I haven't heard it talked about in the industry as something that they would want to necessarily lower. If you are interested, don't pay $99, right? There's always a St. Patrick's sale or a Mother's Day sale or a Prime Day sale, or there's just so many sales.
Yeah. This person asks, who would want to be a sperm donor now?
That's a good question.
And isn't that kind of sad for couples who are seeking one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do wonder if it will. There may be research, and I actually, if there is, I haven't seen it, about whether this is kind of dampening enthusiasm among American men for this. Of course, then there's always, men in other countries who I think are, depending on the regulations in their countries, may be more or less interested. Some countries, for instance, have regulation where at the age of 18, you can find out information about your donor father. So we are in some ways, sort of behind those countries in the sense that we don't offer donor conceived children like any of that information as a means of, at least in terms of regulation. Individual companies, I don't know what individual companies, they may vary. But that's a very good question.
Yeah. This is a personal question. but have you taken a home DNA test, and did you have any surprising results if you did?
Yeah. So I've tested in three places. And you might say, like, why take more than one DNA test, right? Because your DNA is your DNA, right? It's not going to change. But of course, your DNA relatives will vary because different people have tested at different companies. And then your ethnicity estimate varies because, again, it's an estimate, and each company's estimates vary based on the reference populations that they're using to stand in for the various populations that they're attempting to capture, and the algorithms that they're using to parse the information. So it's interpretation. So I was very curious, to test because I wanted to see how those things would vary. And, it was a very good thing that I did because, some of the databases had relatives that others didn't. And those relatives were in many ways key to us understanding our genealogy. So, for instance, on my father's side, there was basically a break in the line. I guess you would call it a non-paternity event. That meant that even though the country we were looking at, their records were good, they were robust records. This was Sweden. We would not have known we had these particular relatives because it wasn't reflected in the record because of this non-paternity event. So the cool thing was that once we tested, we discovered a long-lost cousin who lives in Sweden. This cousin is related on my dad's side through an ancestor who immigrated from Sweden in the 1890s. As a teenager, my great grandmother. And so she, the amazing thing to me is that seems like a really long time ago, the 1890s. It's very hard for me to relate to anyone who lived in the 1890s. And on the other hand, here's a living cousin, right? Like my dad's second cousin, we actually traveled to Sweden and got to meet her after we found her in the databases because her daughter was a genealogist and had done a ton of research and knew all this stuff about our kind of ancestral farmhouse, and we wanted to see it. We wanted to meet her. So to have a kind of living connection to the past made the past feel not so far away. And it reinforced for me just, how we are the products of these tiny little accidental decisions and whims of fate and small decisions that our ancestors made, right, that led us to where we are. And that to me is really profound, the way that the past shaped us, the way that it lives in us, right, and without us even knowing about it, kind of influences our directions. And then on my mother's side, we were able to find, quite amazingly, a branch of the family tree. My mother's side is Jewish. They survived in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, through World War II. And so that to me is amazing because we didn't even know we had that branch of the family. My mother's grandfather left and never spoke of the people he left behind. And so we weren't looking. We didn't have an expectation of cousins. And to find this cousin, I think is my mom's second cousin, and to hear him say, oh yeah, we stayed in Ukraine until I went to Israel 15 years ago, was like, so there's a lot of, there's a lot of opportunity there. The past is not so far away. It's quite accessible to us now. And that's the lesson over and over that I learned as I was writing and researching my book and interviewing people, is that the past isn't over. It shapes us now.
It's still present.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think this will be our last question. What advice do you have for people who are thinking of taking a home DNA test?
So, I guess that I would say the advice that I have is twofold. There are easily more than 1 million people out of the 37 million people who've taken a DNA test who've gotten a significant surprise. So they discovered, that they're not related to dad, or that they have a previously unknown sibling they didn't know about. They discovered their donor conceived, or that they are adopted and no one told them, or that they come from a community that hid its genetic ancestry, or any other of a lot of kind of miscellaneous other scenarios that people are facing right now. Of those million people, that kind of those ripple effects also affect many other people. So, each revelation refracts across many, many families, or many, many people, across multiple families. So, it means that ultimately millions of Americans are kind of grappling with the things we weren't told about the past, right? And yet, every single person that I interviewed, and I've corresponded with or interviewed hundreds of people about their DNA tests, to a man and to a woman, not a single one of them went into it thinking that they were going to be a statistic, right? Not a single one of them said, I wonder if I will take a test and discover something really, really, really surprising that upends my sense of identity and family. There are certainly those who set out looking to answer a question, who is my dad? But for those who didn't, they didn't go into it with even this as a possible thing on their radar, even though the companies gave them this warning. The companies give you this advisory. You may discover things that you're not expecting. You may discover unexpected relatives. Like those kind of advisories don't stick in our brains because it's ludicrous to think that you're about to discover something like that, right? It's like it requires a feat of cognitive distortion to assume that you're going to find something surprising on that level. So I wonder, I do wonder if there's a way to reinforce that for people, to just kind of say like, hey, know this going in that, that no one assumes these statistics will apply to you, but statistics are kind of like, cruel that way, and they just do whatever they want, right? So it could happen to you. And none of us are immune. But on the other hand, because these revelations are not limited to people who actually take a test, and because many of us are affected even though we didn't test because a sibling or an aunt or somebody else tests in our families, in some ways that advice is not so helpful anymore. It was when the databases were smaller, but now they're so pervasive. So the advice that I like to give now is more so along the lines of, for that older generation, the generation of secret keepers, right? Somebody, a parent who might be in possession of knowledge about how their child came into the world that child themselves does not know. That it might be time to consider having a conversation with that child and disclosing that to them, even though it's difficult, because they may find out anyway. There's a very good chance that they will, right? And you may not be around when that happens, right? Or you may be, and they find that the way they got the information is much more painful because it came to them by way of a computer screen. Over and over, people told me that they would much rather have found out that information, even if it was very late in coming, from their parents directly, than finding it out because they took a test and then they had to go and ask their parents about it. So I guess that would be my advice, is to consider the possibility that that's a conversation you want to have. And there is, as a result of the DNA testing age and all these revelations, a growing community of mental health professionals and to some extent mediators who work with people in these situations. So if you're looking for the right language, there might be somebody to hold your hand a little bit.
That's great. Think about the implications and also stop with the secrets. That's great advice. I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one other question, which is, how did you come to write your book, The Lost Family?
Yeah, I am a journalist, and I spent about 10 years at the Washington Post, and the next 10 years as a freelance journalist writing for a variety of outlets. And I've always been interested in science writing and the cognitive sciences and social sciences and human behavior and how we construct our own narratives. And I've always been very interested in intimate stories of ordinary people with extraordinary, stories, or who find themselves in unusual circumstances. More so than the celebrity profiles and the profiles of politicians that we sometimes do as journalists and that I've done. I was always more interested in, sort of that story from the person on the street who has something really profound to share. And that kind of came all together a few years ago when I was in conversation with one of my editors of the Washington Post, and we were talking about DNA testing and its unexpected consequences. And we thought we would do a story about that. And so I set out to find a story about it, and it ran, I think it was July of 2017. And what happened is the story ran, and I kind of went viral, and I got this enormous avalanche of reader email. I'm actually still getting emails to this address. I created a standalone Gmail address. It was DNA testing stories at Gmail. And I started getting people writing me saying, that was a really great story, but now I want to tell you my story. I took a test 3 months ago. I took a test 5 years ago. It's changed my life. It's still going on. I want to share this. And I got on the phone with some of these people and emailed. And these stories were so moving. They were touching us in the places we are at our most vulnerable, the most intimate places, the ways we define ourselves, our relationships with loved ones, our parents. People's lives were really changed, and their emotions were really, brought to the surface. And I felt quite privileged and humbled by that experience of talking to them. And I thought, man, this is not a newspaper story anymore, right? I mean, there are a lot of stories we could write in the newspaper, but this is like affecting Americans from all walks of life. This is, changing the identity, changing family, the American family, and it's really changing our culture. It's a seismic moment. It's a moment we're going to look back on in decades to come, and we're going to say, wow, that really changed how we talk to each other. That really changed our intergenerational conversations. That really changed, how we talk to our own children. That really changed how we think about the past and how much we're entitled to know about ourselves. And I thought, no one is writing this. I want to write a book about it. So that's how The Lost Family came to be.
And it was a great book. I really enjoyed it. And I want to thank you for spending this hour with us and for answering all the questions. And thank you all for tuning in. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good night.
Okay, I ended the live